Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good Monday morning. Just gonna drink a little coffee as people jump on. It's good to see you guys. It is good to be with you. Gosh, there you all are. Hello, 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 hello. You know, if I'm honest, this morning, friends, it was one of those mornings where it was just kind of tough to get out of bed. Do you know what I mean? Can any of you relate to the feeling of it's just sometimes hard to get out of bed? It just was for me. I don't know. You just kind of roll out. You try to get your mind right, and you exist in this kind of fog. But you know, step by step, you sort of find your way, and you get your way to the coffee, and you get your way to the, to everything else, and the day just kind of starts moving from there, right? Anyways, I could see that many of you are joining me, which means that most of you are probably morning people right now. But for those of you who are watching later, I get it. Hey, it is a joy to be with you today. I have the supreme privilege of sharing a small devotional with you, of sharing a moment with you, of going into scripture with you and talking to you about Jesus. So what I'd like to do now is explain kind of what we've been doing. If you've been following along with us, then you know that our senior pastor, Jason Strand, has given us a few words to focus on in this season. In the week that we're in right now, the week that we're starting right now, we're focusing on the word grace. Grace. What does it mean? How does it impact us? How does it influence us? How does it push us closer to Jesus? So when I first heard the word, I had a lot of thoughts that came around the word grace. I had a lot of ideas. But the first was, it kind of took me back all the way to high school, where I remember hearing the word grace and not really knowing what it means. I wonder if in the comments you could tell me some words that maybe you heard growing up in church, or maybe you're new to faith, that you heard about words used that didn't make much sense to you. They were maybe you heard them, they sounded nice, but they didn't mean anything to you. I wonder... there's all kinds of religious, churchy words that we use kind of all the time without actually even thinking about it. Grace was one of those words for me. And in the comments, let me know what words was that for you that you heard in church, but you just didn't actually know what that meant. Surrender. Mariah said surrender. Yeah, that's a good one. So anyways, grace was one of those words for me where... Jason turned, the blessing. Yes. What does that mean? That's so good. Redeemed. Denise says, faith. Yes. Salvation. These are words that are crucial to our relationship to Jesus and our relationship to God, but they're also kind of foreign words because we don't use them every day. We don't use them like we would the word coffee or the word mug or the word, they don't have the same utility in our life. Oh, someone said justification or transformation. Those are really good too. Well, today I want to talk to you about grace. I want to talk to you about what grace has meant to me and what it means to me now, and how I've learned its meaning over the years of my life. I haven't lived too many years yet, but I have certainly experienced a lot of God's good grace. So there are a lot of good translations for the word grace, but the one that I just want to focus on today is undeserved goodness. I think grace is undeserved goodness. And let me tell you what I mean by that. First, let me tell you a story, and then we'll jump into the Bible, and then I'll tell you one more story. So a few years ago, I got my first job out of college, which was I was a high school Bible teacher in Troy, Ohio, and I loved this job. This job was great. It was my first time being in front of people, having some kind of authority. It was my first time teaching the Bible. It was my first time being in front of high school students. If you don't know, that's my job now. I'm the high school teaching pastor at Eagle Brook, and it's one of the great joys of my life. So it was a bunch of firsts for me. And I experienced a lot of great moments and memories in those first few months on that job. But over time, through a series of events, my wife and I decided that living in Ohio and being on staff where I was working just wasn't the right fit. And we had to say goodbye. We had to leave and we had to come back here to Minnesota. That was a really tough decision for a lot of reasons. But one of the reasons why it was tough is because we were like super poor. I mean, we had no money. We had all kinds of college debt that was just kind of kicking in. And we were just looking for a way forward. We were trying to get moving with our life. But we kind of scrounged up as much money as we could. But like with, the U-Haul and the moving expenses, I mean, that's a long way. And so we kept this to ourselves. We kept it quiet. We didn't want to burden anybody with our problems about how we didn't have any money to get back home. But as time moved on, people kind of took notice. They kind of understood that we were young and we were poor and we were trying to make our way in the world. And I have a friend, and he asked me right before I left Ohio, he said, "What do you need?" I gave him the typical response, "We're good, like we're fine, we don't need anything." And he was like, "Really? Like, what do you need?" And I said, "Well, honestly, I'm not sure we can afford to get home." And he kind of like nodded his head. He was like, "Oh, okay." And I thought it was kind of his kind way of wanting to know what was going on, but not really wanting to do anything about it. So it was a fine conversation. Then we moved on. A couple weeks went by, and it was moving day. And I was stepped out of my door to lock the house that we were living in, to leave it behind and to move back to Minnesota. And I looked at my bank account, and I had $1 in my bank account. The whole thing. I had $1 to my name and no job coming up next. And as I walked out my door, I looked at my phone, saw I had $1 in my bank account, put my phone away, and I looked at my feet, and there at my feet was an envelope. And I opened the envelope, and it was from my friend. And I still have this envelope to this day, because in it was a beautiful note that said, "Grace is undeserved goodness. And you, Brandon, you and your wife have been an undeserved goodness to our staff and to our community here in Ohio. And I thought it was time to pay it forward." And inside the envelope was a check for $1,000, which was able to cover just about everything that we needed to move back home and kind of get our feet underneath us. It was unbelievable. I was shocked. I was moved. My heart just beat out of my chest. I couldn't believe that happened. And that's one of the most tangible ideas and images of grace for me. Because when you look in the Bible, the idea of grace spans the whole narrative. It goes from the Old Testament to the New Testament, and it's used in different ways. Different words are used in the Old and New Testament. In the Old Testament, we see a lot of superiority giving to inferiority. So my situation with my friend in Ohio, someone who had the means giving to someone who didn't have the means, or someone who didn't have means going to someone who did and begging for their grace. That's kind of the typical response in the Old Testament, especially when it comes to God and his people. His people were constantly going to God, and God was generous in offering his grace. But in the New Testament, we begin to see that word grace shift and change and develop. In the Old Testament, the word grace is used about 64 times. And the Old Testament takes up most of the Bible. The word grace is used 64 times. And in the New Testament, the word grace is used almost 160 times. Because someone stepped onto the scene and showed us what grace looks like with skin on. And of course, his name is Jesus. Jesus is the fullest representation of who God is, and God, if anything, is gracious. Now, in the first 4 books of the New Testament, those are the stories about Jesus. In the first 3, the word grace isn't used once. But in the 4th book, in the book of John, the word grace is used 4 times just in the first chapter. I'm going to read you just a bit of it here. And this comes from the Message translation, which was composed by a guy named Eugene Peterson. And I loved how he puts this, because he doesn't actually use the word grace, but he defines the word grace for us. Partly because this translation was written for people who don't really use churchy language, but for people who need to hear the good news of God. So this is what he said. He said, "The Word became flesh and blood, and it moved into the neighborhood." Talking about Jesus. Jesus became flesh and blood, and he moved into our neighborhood. We saw the glory with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son. And this is the word grace. Generous inside and out. True from start to finish. In most translations it says, he was full of grace and truth. See, one of the ways the word grace begins to shift is that grace now has a name. Grace now has a face. Grace now has a person. And grace now is a relationship that we can enter into. It becomes transcendent. It becomes greater. It becomes something beyond ourselves that is given into our reality. Grace has moved into our neighborhoods. And that's the person of Jesus. John goes on to say this, "And we live out of Jesus' generous bounty, gift after gift after gift." We got the basics from Moses, which is the Old Testament, and then this exuberant giving and receiving. That's the grace he's talking about. This endless knowing and understanding, all this came through Jesus, the Messiah. No one has ever seen God, not so much as a glimpse. This one-of-a-kind God expression, who exists at the very heart of the Father, has made him plain as day. The reason I read that to you today is because grace can become abstract, right? It's this concept and it's a word that we don't really use, but what we have to remember is that Jesus made grace a person. Jesus made grace an encounter, and Jesus made grace something that we can know, experience, and have a part of our day-to-day lives. And I told you I would tell you one more story. And it's when grace was given a face to me. So, early on in my marriage with my wife, Kelsey, we were told by some doctors that Kelsey had a condition that would really make it difficult for her to ever become pregnant. And they told us that right after we got married, it was time for us to start trying, which was really overwhelming and really difficult. And after a few years of trying, nothing really happened. Nothing moved, and we weren't having any babies. We began to lose hope, and we began to settle into the reality that maybe we wouldn't be able to have children. And then we found out that my daughter, Olive, was conceived. Now, at first, she didn't have a name, right? She was just this little baby. And I remember going into our first ultrasound, and I didn't know anything about ultrasounds. I didn't know anything about how they worked. But, they kind of put something up to my wife's stomach, and we see this little tiny dot that exists on the screen. And then, all of a sudden, I hear something. From this little dot on the screen, I hear a heartbeat. And it gets louder and louder because the practitioner is turning the volume up, and I'm overwhelmed and overcome with emotion, because this thing that I thought was not possible is now ringing in my ears. And it began to become more and more real to me that we had a daughter, and we named her after a verse in Psalms. Her name is Olive, and it comes from a verse that says, "But I will be like an olive tree in the house of God. I will sing the name of the Lord all the days of my life. That was kind of our prayer, and it still is our prayer for my daughter, but we still needed a middle name. We didn't have a family middle name. We didn't have any ideas of what that could be. But I remember thinking about John 1. I remember thinking about Jesus' grace and truth. I remember thinking that Jesus made God's grace into a person, gave him a face, and gave him a name. And I was struck with the transcendence of that. That it wasn't just good thinking. It wasn't just a churchy word. It was real. And so we decided to name my daughter Olive Grace Gilliam, because she was a representation to us of undeserved goodness. And from that day until now, she's 4 now, and she's wild, and she's intelligent, smarter than I am already. But every day, she's a reminder of God's undeserved goodness to me and to my wife and to my family. Because it's real now. It's got a face and a name. And I wonder, my question for you today, just to ponder, as you think about the word grace, as we kind of get our week started, to kind of plant us in the moment, to give us a moment of presence with God. What has God given to you that you don't deserve? And more than that, what is in your life right now that is an undeserved goodness? A goodness that takes you out of your current situation and reminds you that life is precious. It reminds you that humility is better than pride. That love is better than money. That community is better than being alone. What do you have in your life? And I would just encourage you for a moment today to just grab a hold of it, to sit in that presence, to sit in that moment, and just be grateful for the grace that's been given to you. And name it. Call it grace. Call it a gift from God. Something with a face and a name, so that grace no longer becomes this word that's abstract and that's churchy and that's something that only religious people use, but it's a word that we use every day because we have been given grace upon grace. Like John said, we live off of Jesus' generous bounty, gift after gift after gift, but it will only ever mean anything to us if we call it by name. So friends, as you start your week, may the grace of God be with you. May his peace overcome you. And may you sit in the presence of knowing that God's grace is an undeserved goodness that takes us out of our situation and elevates our perspective and puts it on Jesus. So, for all of you who had a hard time waking up this morning, good morning. Grab a cup of coffee. It's truly a grace every morning to have a cup of coffee. Thank you for joining us. Continue to follow along this week, because this week is leading us up to baptism, which is coming in just a few days. So keep on the lookout for details about how to sign up. That is an expression of God's grace in our life for sure. So we're praying for you. We love you. Have a great rest of the day. Grace be with you.